Welcome to News from Neptune for May 3rd in the 18th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." That begins by calling things by their right names, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. Close quote. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China, for example. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on another cuckoo edition of News from Neptune, with crazy coups by the mad and bad American government in Caracas and in Washington against elected presidents Maduro and Trump. The situation in Venezuela is serious. The situation in Washington is serious too, but not serious in the same way. A word about the coups in both places comes from Pepe Escobar, the international correspondent whose writing on these matters has been for a long time particularly insightful. He points out that Psycho Bolton, he's referring to the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, about whom there's a strange article in the New Yorker this week, is the chief warmonger. He's in control of policy. That's how dangerous it is. The Pentagon, on the contrary, doesn't want war. The neocons around Bolton do. Pentagon doesn't want war. No South or Central American nation will join, except not leading from behind or anywhere else, Colombia. Thus the excitement about Eric Prince's 5,000 mercenaries. He has told the American government that he'll put together 5,000 fighters and be the advanced force of an American invasion of Venezuela, even though the Pentagon doesn't want to do that. Meanwhile, the Russian Foreign Secretary Lavrov told the American Foreign Secretary, the American Secretary of State, Pompeo, in no uncertain terms, that no messing around in Venezuela would be tolerated. This is not part of the account of Venezuela we've heard this week. The Russians have made it clear to the Americans, the various factions within the American government, that they will oppose any armed intervention in Venezuela, an obviously dangerous situation. Meanwhile, Trump is looking for support from the Cuban and Venezuelan diaspora in Florida, a state important for his reelection. So there are a variety of views amongst the participants in the assault on Venezuela underway by the United States right now. But the outcome or the result of these various forces seems to be a hesitancy to turn Venezuela into a quagmire of the Afghanistan or Vietnam order, which the neocons in Washington want to do. I suppose one can think of this as hopeful, but since we've been getting such a inaccurate account of it from mainstream media. It's very difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future, as Yogi Berra said. What's top of your list, David?
Speaking of baseball,
Yeah.
Casey Stengel is alleged to have said when he managed the New York Mets in 1962, "Can't anyone here play this game?"
Exactly.
And that's sort of what I was thinking about. I actually looked that up to see if it was actually true that he said that. And as usual with these things, there's no proof that he actually said that.
Right.
But Jimmy Breslin, the famous columnist of the New York papers, wrote a book about the Mets of 1962 called "Can't Anyone Here Play This Game?" That was the year that the Mets, the first year of the Mets, when they didn't give expansion teams any decent players to play with, so they won 40 games and lost 102 games, or something like that, or no, 120 games, and they came 60 games behind the first place team in that year, and the only other time that a first place team beat the last place team by 60 games is when the Red Sox beat the Baltimore Orioles last year.
There we are.
By 60 games.
Uh-huh.
So you see what I'm getting at here.
I do.
Tell me what I'm getting at. Anyway, so can't anyone here play this game? The New York Times is having trouble figuring out what to do about Venezuela. First they had it on the top of the page when the coup seemed to be going on. Then it was put in the back pages when things weren't going so well. And then this morning, or in the last day or two, we find a column that they like to call the interpreter by Max Fisher, and with a credit to your friend Amanda Taub.
Oh yes.
And what the interpreter was doing a horrible job of trying to explain was how coups go and why some coups go and some coups don't work. And they were talking about Libya, Gaddafi, when he came to power, and they were talking about other things. And they weren't really getting to any, it was really a big mess. They weren't really getting, Max Fisher, wasn't really getting to any point at all in terms of just saying that the people of Venezuela don't support this coup. I mean, it's all about whether the army does this and the army does that. But it's clear that there's different kinds of coups. There are genuinely populist coups, like you might say Castro was a populist coup, and you might say Chavez, when he first tried a coup in the late 1990s, was a populist coup. But what Juan Guaido was trying to do is not a populist coup, and the people don't support it. And so anyway, that's just what I wanted to say about that.
And the only thing that is probably worthwhile adding to the accounts that we're getting is how conflicted the various powers in Washington are about the illegal operations against Venezuela that the American government has undertaken. They don't speak with one voice, and the contradictions between what's being said now by the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor and the anti-interventionist rhetoric that contributed to making Donald Trump president it needs to be highlighted. The accounts we're getting of the various factions in Washington are not very accurate, and we need to sort those out while the Democrats in Congress are busily calling the Republican administrations liars on a ridiculous issue. That is what Mueller said to Barr in regard to the to his investigation. A serious issue involving literal life and death of certainly Venezuelans, many other people around the world, is being ignored, and that's outrageous.
The Common Dreams website had a brief article on Joe Biden and his views on Venezuela, entitled "Biden Sides with Trump, Bolton, and Pompeo in Backing Coup Effort in Venezuela." Despite progressive critics and anti-war voices speaking forcefully against the Trump administration's overt backing of the attempted coup d'etat, by right-wing opposition forces in Venezuela on Tuesday. I presume that's this past Tuesday. 2020 Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden aligned himself with the White House by throwing his support behind the overthrow effort. Quote, quoting Biden, who tweeted actually, "The violence in Venezuela today against peaceful protesters is criminal. Maduro's regime is responsible for incredible suffering. The U.S. must stand with the National Assembly and Guaido in their efforts to restore democracy." Notice,
Incredible.
restore democracy
Yeah, right.
through legitimate, internationally monitored elections. End quote.
We're going to restore democracy by a coup against a democratically elected president. This is the American position, and if it strikes you as mad, just realize this is nothing new. The U.S. In the Obama administration claimed to contribute to restoring democracy in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, what the U.S. government was doing was backing a coup that involved actual Nazis against a democratically elected president. So there's nothing new here. The only thing new is the conflict of the various motives within the American government as it stands right now, various short-term motives, like the difference between the Pentagon and the National Security Advisor on how these illegal actions should be carried out.
So I want to say a couple things about Joe Biden, or must I?
Yeah, took the words out of my mouth. These are the things that we shouldn't have to say.
You know, the New York Times is busy nuancing Biden's candidacy in various ways. Paul Krugman writes, and this is a way of supporting Biden against Sanders and Biden against anyone to Biden's supposed left. And he wrote a strange kind of obfuscatory column about Biden and Sanders, and as did David Brooks, as does everybody at the New York Times these days. But listen to what this just changes the subject, but whatever. Krugman writes, just to give you an idea where Paul Krugman, our liberal economist at the New York Times, who sort of represents the what do you call the kind of special, very, very special people, or the very something people.
Liberal in the worst sense of the word.
Yeah, he wrote, and he's writing about Sanders' support for Medicare for all. He writes, that, after all, is what his Medicare for all push, which would eliminate private insurance, amounts to. He's saying to the 180 million Americans who currently have private insurance, many of whom are satisfied with their coverage, quote, Sanders is saying to them, I'm going to take away the insurance you have and replace it with the government program. Also, you're going to pay a lot more in taxes. But trust me, the program will be better than what you have now, and the new taxes will be less than you currently pay in premiums. In other words, Krugman is mocking Sanders' support, alleged support for Medicare for all. And then Krugman goes on, could these claims be true? Yes. In other words, Krugman is saying, yes, Sanders might be right in saying that people will actually pay less when all of it comes out. People will pay less for a nationalized program than they would for their private insurance. Obviously they would. Anybody who studied the issue knows that. But Krugman goes on, could these claims be true? Yes. Will voters believe them? Probably not. Implying, well, it's not a strategically, tactically good strategy to go that way. Krugman goes on, polling shows that support for Medicare for all falls off drastically when people are informed that it would eliminate private insurance and require higher taxes. You might try to rationalize Sanders' position by saying that Medicare for all is an aspirational plan, and that in practice he would be willing to accept a more gradualist approach. But that's not what his behavior suggests. On the contrary, Sanders has conspicuously refused to support measures that would enhance Obamacare, even as a temporary expedient. So Krugman here is pulling out all the stops to present Sanders as being somehow too radical on health care. I mean, from this supposedly sort of moderate, left liberal columnist and Nobel Prize winning or, whatever prize winning economist he is, it's pretty remarkable,
Yes.
I guess.
It's very remarkable, it seems to me. It's also remarkable to me that the discussion, such as it is, of what we in this country call Medicare for all, is as thin as you think it would be. I mean, when the tentative accounts of Bernie Sanders are the most advanced and most significant proposals put forward on this matter, something very strange is going on here and has been going on for a long time. I mean, remember that the equivalent of Medicare for all, of making health care available to all Americans regardless of their ability to pay, something like that has been proposed in America at least since the 1930s. It was part of the original New Deal suggestions by the fact that it was noted that people needed A, food, B, shelter, and C, health care. And that seemed
Who
to be...
knew? Who knew?
Exactly. That seemed to be a fairly basic place to start. Now, if we compare the United States with the other countries that are economically similar around the world, we find that in the generations since the 1930s, since the Great Depression, all of these things have been provided to some extent in the capitalist democracies. We'll quibble over words there. But that America has been notably lax in providing health care. Any place else, from Canada to Italy, health care, what we would call Medicare for all, is a given. It's a matter of fact. It is the basic situation that even poor capitalist countries have been able to produce.
Like Portugal or someplace like that.
Portugal has done a remarkable job on this.
Yeah.
Portugal is so far in advance of most of these other countries in regard to drug treatment that we should be talking about it and aren't.
With a per capita GDP of probably half of what we have in this country,
in
real terms.
Yeah, exactly,
if that,
right,
exactly.
Right. But so, I mean, the suppression of an accurate discussion of Medicare for all, which people like Paul Krugman in the New York Times, and the example that you just gave, are particularly good at that, has been remarkably effective across the country. We will look back and shake our heads at this at the point where we finally do manage to come up to the level of Portugal.
It seems like if you actually tried to explain to people who supposedly, of course people like their health insurance if that's what they've got and their employer, especially if their employer is paying for most of it. Of course, people are a little afraid of what change might mean, but people go off of their private health care and onto Medicare all the time. Mm-hmm. Although there's these Medicare Advantage, might be too, which includes this Medicare Advantage type private health policy, which I have, but still. I wasn't afraid, and it seems like if people have these things explained to them properly, especially in terms of cost, if people understood how expensive our healthcare system is how when it all comes out, the society as a whole will be devoting less of its resources to a better healthcare system, that people would want to take the plunge for that, and then again. I'm not even sure what Krugman is saying is actually true in terms of what people say, because you keep hearing poll data that shows that 70 or 80% of the people support this kind of Medicare for all program. One reference also, to give the New York Times a little bit of credit, they did publish a column within the last week or so by Matt Brunig, who a young guy, about 30 years old, very brilliant, who runs this thing called the People's Policy Project, which he contributes to sort of his kind of gifted autism, I think. He's a kind of strange mind, but he wrote a good column that the New York Times published, which explained when we look at people, how people pay for health care and how it all works out, that people are actually paying a lot more for health care than they think they are, even when they have insurance, and that would change. And what Dean Baker writes just recently on his blog, he wrote a long article about the universal health care, and he wrote, the bulk of the cost of implementing a universal Medicare program will come from shifting payments for employer-provided health insurance to the government. The amount of additional revenue required for a universal Medicare program will depend on the extent to which the cost of healthcare inputs, e.g. prescription drugs, medical equipment, doctors, can be brought in line with other wealthy countries. That's the key, that what we're paying more for is patented drugs, expensive doctors, and expensive medical equipment that due to that sort of monopoly patent-driven thing. So and then also reduce costs. And what Baker concludes, reduced costs can be associated with better care, not just better care, but with universal care. But at the very least, you can insure everyone for relatively the same expensive costs that we have now, and then you go from there to reduce those costs.
But you see the great flaw in that, David,
yes,
is that even though those costs remain in the same area and can be or can be reduced, the fact of the matter is the money goes somewhere different.
Yeah.
The money doesn't go into the private pockets of the healthcare industry.
Right.
The money goes into taxes. Money goes into paying for those various things that should be provided by a reasonable national healthcare system. Mm-hmm. The reason that liberals like Krugman and others are opposed to Medicare for all, even in the thin system that Bernie Sanders is proposing, is that it will cost some people money. And those some people are the very wealthy people who run the healthcare system, the financial healthcare system that we actually have in this country. They're not going to give up without a fight, and they've enlisted the Krugmans of this world in their fight. We should make this clear.
From the liberal edge, from the alleged liberal edge of New York Times columnists, maybe Krugman could be considered as not as liberal as Michelle Goldberg. I don't know how you evaluate these things. But it's clear that someone like Krugman is afraid of a social democrat, of Bernie Sanders, a social democrat, not a socialist, a social democrat. He's afraid of him. He's looking for wedge issues with which to marginalize Sanders and to rationalize supporting Joe Biden or maybe Elizabeth Warren. I'm not sure. Warren, I think, is probably more on the Medicare for all side, but it's odd. You have to look for wedge issues in something like health care because Krugman probably doesn't want to go the Zionism route. He doesn't want to see support for Israel as being a kind of wedge issue. Someone else probably would, but he doesn't. So that's what you've got, and it's pretty appalling.
It is indeed, and the overall situation, I think, is that the American ruling class understands that there is indeed a populist wave out there, a populist wave that, as David keeps pointing out, has both, as it were, right and left wings. I'm not even sure it's as clear as wings. I'm just sort of the populist wave itself is an attitude and a general analysis of the situation without specifics that are necessary in order to make any progress along those lines. But the American ruling class is aware of that populist wave out there and was taken by surprise when that populist wave produced a president in the remarkable figure of Donald Trump, remarkable in a number of senses perhaps. But they know it's out there. They know the populist rage is out there, and they know it has to be contained. And when it produces occasional insurgents within the political system, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, the establishment is ready to ring the fire alarms and say, you know, this has to be stopped before it gets out of hand, because there's a great deal behind it. In fact, the representatives of the populist wave, like Donald Trump and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they both are representatives of it, are fairly tentative examples of what that situation is. And the circumstances that suggest that it has to be dealt with are general, not specifics. I had a particularly bad example, I thought, of that this week in regard to the Venezuela affair and Ocasio-Cortez, the new representative from New York, who has caused a lot of comment by her own talents and her own comments, a lot of comment about, because she is a first flowering of this populist wave. I think that metaphor is thoroughly mixed and ready to be served. But in any case,
flowers on waves. I don't know.
Exactly right. The bloom is off the rose and is on the wave. Jeffrey Sinclair, editor of Counterpunch, points out this week that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whom he calls the lipstick Lenin, he's already gotten feminist objections to that, but in any case, what he means is
got to be careful.
Something about this tentativeness of the young populist representatives like Ocasio-Cortez. Ocasio-Cortez was asked whether she considered the Maduro government in Venezuela legitimate. It's a bit of a loaded question because, of course, the U.S. is busily trying to overthrow that government and get its hands on the oil resources of Venezuela, and proclaimed a coup this week in order to do it. Her tepid reply was, quote, "I defer to caucus leadership on how we navigate this," close quote. That's not very revolutionary.
Come on, AOC, you can do better than that.
Exactly. The caucus leadership she refers to is Nancy Pelosi, the head of the Democratic caucus, as well as other things, in the Congress. Lead a caucus leadership on how we navigate this. Apparently, the difference, says Jeffrey, apparently the difference between a Democratic socialist and a socialist is wider than the difference between a Biden Democrat and a Trump Republican. The notion that a Democratic socialist, that Ocasio-Cortez, said we're going to follow caucus leadership, that is the Democratic Party in Congress, on the coup that the U.S. is trying to manufacture in Venezuela, is outrageous. Now, you have to have some sympathy for the immense pressures Ocasio-Cortez is under here, but that really is a terrible admission of her acquiescence to politics as usual. In some ways, far worse than Joe Biden. We know what a criminal he is, but for Ocasio-Cortez to say, well, I'm going to stick with the criminals on this one, is too much.
What Jeffrey wrote about Biden this morning briefly was, if you don't think Biden's the perfect person to represent the Democratic Party, you haven't paid much attention to what the Democratic Party has become over the last 25 years. Interventionist, anti-regulation, pro-austerity, merciless on black crime, and devoted to Israel.
Exactly.
And I have to admit, when Biden finally declared for the race and they started polling about it, I'm surprised that they show Biden far ahead of Sanders, and they show Sanders falling off. I mean, I have my doubts. I looked up a little bit on the polling methods and so forth, and whether polls are real. But they, they still know how to do polls, and they're probably somewhat accurately reflecting potential primary voters or whatever it is that they're doing. I mean, I think that these major polling outfits do have some credibility involved, and they try to do things right. There are others that don't, but still, it's kind of shocking. And I have to say, and at the risk of losing half of my few friends that I have left, I have to say I can't imagine voting for Biden against Trump, and I can't imagine for voting for Trump against Biden.
I couldn't agree with you more on both points.
And now we have no friends whatsoever.
Now, the notion that that Biden is in opposition to Trump has much more to do with the propagandizing of the American public than it does with what either of these people would do in office. As we saw, Trump was elected in part, Trump became president in part because he was the first major party presidential candidate in 40 years to attack neoliberal and neoconservative policies. He said he was an anti-interventionist. He said he was against the trade pacts that neoliberalism was establishing around the world. The accounts that he gave to people in the campaign convinced many folks that the Obama-Clinton administration, which had promised hope and change and produced neither for a majority of Americans, could be replaced by an administration that did something different. Now, what we found once Trump got into office was that the neoliberal and neoconservative policies continued with mainly cosmetic changes at best, and the situation of Americans who knew that the government was not working in their interests really hadn't changed very much. So the idea that the propaganda system can produce enough people convinced that, if we only get Joe Biden into the presidency, everything will be okay, is looking thinner and thinner. And the people who run the country know that. They're worried. They're worried, and they should be.
And to add injury to insult, maybe you got this email yesterday, I did, from Howie Hawkins, or the supporters of Howie Hawkins, who is a venerable Green Party candidate in New York State, who I have some respect for, of course. But here he's sending out an email, and he's saying that the anti-Semitic attack, the recent one in Southern California, is basically, which resulted in one death, horribly, of course, was basically Donald Trump's fault. And the first agenda of the Green Party should be to impeach Donald Trump. That's what we're getting from sort of a somewhat sort of unofficial national Green Party leader, assuming Jill Stein isn't quite as much the leader as she once was. Howie Hawkins is probably the most recognizable name, at least among people who follow these things. And I think that's an appalling tactic for him to take on behalf of whether he's doing it on behalf of the Green Party or just as his own views.
I'm shocked, too, because, of course, what the political establishment in America has been trying to do ever since the election of Donald Trump is point out that if you're unhappy with what the government is doing and its neocon and neoliberal policies, then make sure we get rid of Donald Trump because he's the source of that. Now, this is completely upside down, and the push for impeachment of Trump is, in fact, an attempt to squash any of those dissident and dangerous ideas, which Trump himself has now largely abandoned, that helped to make him president. Now, this is an amazing situation, and the cynical attempt to use the Russiagate nonsense against Trump and say this is the source of our problems is vicious and should be rejected. But the impeachment issue, I think, actually has a different dimension to it that once again, in my optimistic moods, seem to be able to go in the right direction. Remember that impeachment is in fact a peculiar constitutional element. It's an old-fashioned notion. It's abandoned in modern democratic systems, abandoned, for example, in the British and German political systems. It's left over from the 18th century when it was written down into the American Constitution, which defines impeachment at the federal level and limits it to, quote, the president, vice president, all civil officers of the United States who may be impeached and removed, quote, only for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. High crimes means crimes performed by high officials, by officers. High crimes and misdemeanors doesn't define the crime so much as the person accused of the crime. These people can, so impeachment is limited to activities in office by officials. Treason tops the list, and that's the one that the political establishment said should be used to impeach Trump. In this old-fashioned way, the American Constitution specifically defined treason as, quote, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, note the plural, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. This, as I say, is archaic. It's old-fashioned. And it was played out in the early days of the American Republic in regard to Aaron Burr and the legal consideration of this, as it were, old-fashioned definition of treason. There is no way, it seems to me, in spite of all the exercises of Russiagate, that Trump can be convicted of treason, although many liberal publications in this country, notably The Intercept, were busily trying to define treason in such a way as to make Trump impeachable for it. There's another aspect here, though. Remember that high crimes and misdemeanors account of the Constitution, and it's certainly the case that Trump has committed high crimes and misdemeanors within the meaning of the act. In fact, he is guilty of what the Nuremberg Tribunal called the supreme international crime. That supreme international crime, according to the court, peculiarly constituted, that the Americans put together after the Second World War in order to try the Nazi leaders, the supreme international crime is aggression. The supreme international crime is making war without a proper excuse. The supreme international crime differs from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, said the Nuremberg Tribunal. And so the conviction of aggression constitutes a widening of the notion of treason. Trump is guilty of that. All American presidents since the Second World War, since the Nuremberg Tribunal wrote those words, have committed aggression within the meaning of the act. Look at the wars of the United States since 1945, which have killed, by conservative estimate, more than 20 million people in order to defend that economic hegemony that the U.S. Earned, in one sense of the word, from that war. That's what we've been doing in Vietnam, in Latin America, in the Middle East, literally around the world, in every American administration since World War II. Trump's guilty of that, as were the other American presidents. And if one wants to think about the implications of the notion of high crimes and misdemeanors, he certainly could be impeached for it, but not for the sort of nonsense the Democrats are talking about right now. You're watching News from Neptune. We're trying to talk about the peculiarities of the week's news and its development in ways that defy rational explanation in most cases.
Speaking of non-rational or irrational, what do you think about this? The New York Times published an editorial, "The Rising Tide of Anti-Semitism," in which it wrote, by publishing a big, this was actually was them apologizing for a cartoon in their international edition. Quote, by publishing a bigoted cartoon, the Times ignored the lessons of history, including its own. The Times published an appalling political cartoon in the opinion pages of its international print edition late last week. It portrayed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel as a dog wearing a Star of David on a collar. He was leading President Trump, drawn as a blind man wearing a skull cap. That is a Jewish religious head covering that men wear in synagogues, or that Orthodox men wear all the time. Any comments on that? That was probably written by one of their editorial board members, who I'm sure is assigned these projects, Barry Weiss, who's the most sort of outed Zionist on their editorial board, sort of the liberal Zionist attack dog. I don't quite know where to go with this, but it seems like lately, in spite of I have to stick to my own guns here and say that in spite of the attack in Southern California, on top of the attack in Pittsburgh, I don't think anti-Semitism is this kind of specter in this society. There isn't a rising tide of anti-Semitism, as this New York Times. There really isn't any evidence for that. And even Philip Weiss of the Mondo Weiss website had a kind of mea culpa, where he wrote a column, "I was wrong about anti-Semitism going away," in which he talks about, well, it's worse than he thought it was. But the question is, what is it, and what does it do, and how does it motivate people, and what's the baseline here? And I mean, Weiss admits that there's not going to be another Holocaust. Okay, fine, of course not. But it just doesn't make any sense to understand anti-Semitism as this kind of primal force in the cultural psychology, the political psychology of this country, apart from everything else that's going on in our economic system, in our war-making system, in the system these people live under, and in terms of these shooters, where they're coming out of and what the justifications they're using for what they do. This is propaganda, kind of propaganda, I think, in response to these things.
As usual in most political questions, most political disputes or analyses such as this is a fake analysis, the first question to ask is cui bono? Whose interests are served by attacks on anti-Semitism, or by the assertion that anti-Semitism is the problem? Now, if we take this cartoon as an example, it becomes clear pretty quickly whose interests are being served by outrage over anti-Semitism. What the cartoon actually shows is the Israeli government, in the person of its prime minister, leading an otherwise clueless American government in the person of its president. Now, that's not far from the comment that produced such outrage against Representative Omar of Minnesota, when she said that it's all about the Benjamins,
right.
baby,
Yeah.
meaning the contributions of the Israeli government or of the state of Israel to the United States. Now, the problem with this is that one shouldn't be appalled by these accounts as indicating the viciousness of anti-Semitism, one should be appalled at its inaccurate political analysis. We've argued here frequently on this program that, well, we're no partisans of the State of Israel. The notion that American policy is determined by the State of Israel and not the other way around is simply false. The United States supports Israel because Israel is part of the overall framework of order, as Henry Kissinger said, in the Middle East, whereby the U.S. controls the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf as the principal weapon, the principal lever it uses against both friend and foe, from Germany to China. Israel is a stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, serving American interests in terms of the control of the flow of oil. This is not surprising, it's not new, it's simply not recognized as the major reason for the connection between Israel and the United States. And people who consider themselves on the left, just like people who consider themselves on the right, say the problem is that Israel is determining American policy. Well, certainly Israel has a great deal of effect on American policy in that the attempt by the State of Israel to make sure that its interests are served by the United States dovetails with the more important American demand that Israel serve American policy, particularly in regard to the flow of oil. So the cartoon suggesting that a blind America is being led by an Israeli dog is a repetition of this argument. And the problem is not that it's anti-Semitic, the problem is that it's false.
Exactly.
And it's important for us to talk about what the real relationship is and why the U.S. gives the vast number of Benjamins that it does each year to Israel, and why the relationship is criminal.
In the sense, I mean, again, you know, you follow down this path with what Ilhan Omar said. It is all about the Benjamins, but not quite in the sense that either she implied or that people interpreted her as having stated. It's all about the Benjamins in the much broader Benjamin sense, in the much broader geopolitical economic sense, global geopolitical economic resource sense, Benjamins in terms of resources which translate into money. And that's what's driving the relationship between the U.S. and its allies in the Middle East, not just Israel, but obviously Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Gulf states, and so forth.
And most acutely today, it's driving the U.S. Closer and closer to the war with Iran that the neoconservatives have been calling for since the last administration. This is the argument that we should be having. We should be exposing the crimes of the United States against Iran and the result of the policy that has now been impressed upon the Trump administration of war provocations, if not absolute outright war, against the government of Iran. This is very dangerous, this is worthwhile, and of course the propaganda that keeps the American public from realizing what the real relationship is between the U.S., Iran, and Israel, and Saudi Arabia too, serves the interests of primarily the U.S. ruling class. This is what needs to be exposed. We have a few minutes left for some other things. You have another point?
I have other things, but is there anything there from our correspondent that you wanted to?
We have a large number of notes from our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, this week, which we have barely scratched the surface of so far this evening. I'll put these notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune and suggest that they be noticed as we'll take advantage of Jeff's excellent work and incorporate these things by reference, as they say in the law, and we'll end up talking about them, I'm sure, in the future.
I do want to thank you for clarifying the high crimes, because I really never understood what high crimes actually meant. I just thought it was like really bad crimes, not crimes done by people up high.
Instead of low crimes, which
Yeah,
are like, you
yeah,
know, not picking
yeah.
up a check or something.
Yeah,
like
right.
One thing I did want to mention was that the question of Russia in fact and in fantasy has haunted the week. Aaron Matei, a reporter for a number of groups and publications, has been the leading, perhaps, American critic of the Russiagate nonsense. And he writes this week, I think quite rightly, "Here I thought that the collapse of a 2-year conspiracy theory," he's referring to Russiagate, "would spark some minimal self-reflection." He's talking about the American political, mainstream media. "Of course not. If you were deluded enough to peddle Russiagate, of course you're deluded enough to now peddle that Attorney General Barr somehow covered up the report he actually released." That says in 2 sentences, it seems to me. I mean, when we have Nancy Pelosi going on television and saying, in her half-demented way, Attorney General Barr committed a crime by lying to the American people. What did he lie about? He may not have given quite an accurate report of a personal communication between Robert Mueller and himself. He lied to the American people. That's a crime, said Nancy Pelosi. You know, this is the exercise in missing the point that Russiagate has been all along. It's not an accidental missing the point. It's a purposeful and complete misleading of the American public, and Matei has been one of the major figures exposing it. It's really quite shocking how many Americans think that an evil Russian plot produced the results of American elections. It's not true, and the evidence of a plot is far less than the evidence for a plot by the United States to influence, say, the British elections the last time they occurred. The actual behavior of Russia is misrepresented in the American media and by the American government, and it is fairly important for some of the issues we've been talking about tonight. Foreign Minister of Russia will meet the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, next week in a meeting in Finland to talk about the relationships, apparently, between Russia and the United States in regard to Venezuela and elsewhere. This is important because it seems pretty clear that the constraint on America and the American invasion of Venezuela, the constraint on the attempt by the United States to overthrow the government of Venezuela, the Maduro presidency, has been stymied by a remarkable combination of the Pentagon, which doesn't want to put troops into another potential Afghanistan, and Russia, which has told the United States in no uncertain terms that it will not stand by for American troops being sent to Venezuela. A strange and interesting situation. Lavrov and Pompeo, who's mad as a hatter himself, will have a lot to talk about in Finland.
Yeah, and I don't have anything to add to that particularly, but it's just fascinating the way this thing has been covered and the way the Mueller, I could hardly tell all those people apart from each other. Mueller, Barr, Comey, I mean,
Right.
they're all like these people who say this and say that, and they rise to the top of the news, while Venezuela falls to the bottom when the coup isn't working out all that well. So yeah, my comment, my sort of extraneous comment again would be, I had a letter in the paper, I think, since the last time we spoke, and I had spoken about it on our previous show about the state budget and the whole state taxation thing, and the persistent efforts of the News Gazette editors to kind of poo-poo the idea that you could actually tax the upper percentage of wealthy people without taxing the so-called middle class, and I'm just astonished at the lack of data that is presented locally in our academic community, in our allegedly politically progressive community regarding what the nature is of our economy in this state, our income, our wealth, our tax structure, and how easy it would be to collect a few $billion. I mean, with all this straining and lifting that Pritzker is doing to collect $3 or $4 billion, in which instead he could easily, straightforwardly collect $10 or $15 billion to really put our state in good stead. He refuses to do that. People who are going to support him in his efforts are going to do so in a kind of mealy-mouthed way, and then the News Gazette is going to oppose this every step of the way by kind of obfuscating the issue by saying, well, you just can't do this without taxing the middle class, as if the middle class is going to die or leave the state if they pay $100 more in state taxes. It's just an astonishing spectacle to me, the whole thing across the board.
And we've talked about other tax forms before,
of course,
such
yes.
as a financial transaction tax that should be considered here. In the words of a famous Illinois legislator, Senator Dirksen,
Yeah.
$1 billion here, $1 billion there. Before long, you're talking real money.
Yeah, and I mean, it's easy for the News Gazette. The problem is, again, Mike Madigan is a kind of evil figure in Illinois politics, but not for the reason that the News Gazette criticizes him. The Illinois government has been absolutely compliant with neoliberal policies, maybe not as compliant as other states in cutting taxes and cutting services. But still, the fact that the Democratic Party is dominant in this state allows for some support for programs, but it's a pretty superficial support. And what the Democratic controlled government does is abide by this dysfunctional tax system without being honest about what is needed, what little is needed to actually fix it. And that's what they're continuing to do in the manner in which Pritzker is going about this.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 18th week of 2019, another coup week, with crazy coups by the mad and bad American government in Caracas and Washington against elected Presidents Maduro and Trump. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young with Andrew Scollery. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson, most of which we didn't get to tonight. And may the 4th be with you, and you with us. The regular monthly anti-war demonstration in Champaign, going on for 20 years now, will be held tomorrow, Saturday, May 4th, 2 to 4 p.m. at the intersection of Main and Neal Streets in downtown Champaign at the Susan B. Anthony Fountain. Susan B. Anthony, a feminist born in 1820, campaigned for votes for women and against abortion. We'll say some more about that perhaps next week. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.